You know, I don't have a joke at the top here. I'm just gonna say it's nice to see Tignataro back. Hello, interwebs! I hope you're doing well because it is time to review the latest episode of Star Trek Discovery, Season 4, Episode 5, The Examples. We have a lot to talk about with this episode because, staying spoiler-free up front, I have a lot of thoughts on this episode in a kind of very mixed way, because unlike the last two episodes of the season so far, which were much more dealing with ancillary problems to our main forward thrust of the story this season with the Anomaly, that sort of mystery box storyline that's been going on, this episode brings us right back to it, and kind of did exactly what I was hoping that they would not do with that storyline. Again, kind of staying a little bit spoiler-free here. But that being said, watching this episode, even though they took this storyline in a direction that I did not like, it is doing the best possible version of it, because by the end of the episode, I kind of had come back around to being upset by the choice that they make, and then by the end of the episode being more like, okay, I'm interested. You've got me interested. I'm still frustrated that this is the direction that you went with, but I'm a little bit hooked. So maybe they can turn it around for me, and maybe they'll convince me that my hopes for this season, despite them being dashed, were incorrect, or that there's another way to take this. So we'll get into it a little bit more in spoilers, but I have a lot of thoughts by the direction of the Anomaly this episode that kind of frustrated me. However, taking the season-long storyline into a box and putting it off to the side in its own little mystery box over here, I will say the actual plot of this episode and its focus was truly Star Trek in some of the best possible ways. I think some of the best Star Trek and some of the Star Trek that has lasted the ages, besides stuff that is focused on character, has been episodes that have focused on a present-day political topic. And this episode does that, I think, with true aplomb, because obviously the Anomaly has been a kind of pseudo-metaphor for the ongoing pandemic in 2020 and 2021, and this episode takes a topic within that, how we treated prisoners during the opening months of the pandemic, and sort of disregarding them and not thinking about them, and how that dehumanized them. I think this episode really addresses and tackles that in a great way, with Burnham and the Discovery crew having to rescue some prisoners that had been abandoned during an evacuation from the Anomaly. I think that while it did not handle all the stuff that you can talk about with prisons and how people are treated in prisons, and especially how there's like racial aspects to that as well, this episode does have a lot to say about our dehumanization of prisoners and our sort of casting aside of prisoners for numerous different reasons in our society today. And I think that it handled it with true aplomb. And I do think that there was some good action and fun stuff in there as well that I really, really enjoyed. And getting into the B and C plots of this episode, the B plot focusing on Stamets was a lot of fun. It mainly was pushing for that Anomaly plot. We'll talk a little bit about that in the spoiler-filled section, but there was also some good character stuff in there for both Saru and Stamets. Some stuff that I think people will find a little bit laughable, but I think the show is allowing us to laugh at it too. So we'll talk a little bit more about that in spoilers, but I think the true heart of this episode was the C plot. I'm going to talk about this more in the spoiler-filled section, but the scenes with Culber in this episode, I actually have to admit that I cried during them. There was one scene that hit me right in the gut because it felt like it was speaking directly to my own personal neuroses and issues, and it was just advice that I honestly kind of needed to hear. And it just goes to show me that this season's focus on mental health in the face of these big world-changing events like a pandemic is needed and necessary, and I really appreciate Star Trek Discovery's focus on mental health this season. And we'll talk a little bit more about that, and I'll be a little bit personal with all of you because I'm going to have to be a little bit personal about one of the scenes that just really affected me. So on the whole, while I do have issues with this episode's pushing forward of the season-long story arc, I think that on a individual level, just focusing on this episode and what it was doing for itself and within itself, I think it was really great. And I think another strong addition to this season, making this, I think, still one of the strongest seasons of Discovery that I've seen so far, even though I do still have issues with their overall season-long plotting. But we'll get to that in my spoiler-filled section. So if you have not seen the episode, please disembark here, my good friends. I don't know why I've suddenly become Russian, but this is good. It is good. Jump off here. We go into spoilers now. I'm sorry, I don't know what that was. But anyways, let's get into spoilers, folks. Sorry about that. To open the episode, we have a few different Federation ships watching the Anomaly, and first off, we get the USS Janeway, because of course there's a USS Janeway. And also, if you look, there was like a Proto-NX-01 ship there too, which looked kind of cool, and a Vulcan-looking ship. It was just, I was having fun with the shipborne here. But at that moment, the Anomaly jumps away and reappears somewhere else, proving to Stamets and Tig Notaro, who is back as Jet Reno, which I'm so glad to see her. She was sorely missed. I knew that Tig Notaro was not able to join the show for a few episodes because of the pandemic earlier on in their filming date, so it's nice to see her back a little bit earlier than I expected to see her this season. So just nice to see her show back up here. But obviously proving to the crew that this anomaly is man-made. And so right from the bat, I was already kind of frustrated with this episode because I was really, really hoping that the anomaly was not going to be a man-made phenomenon, because that means that there's going to be this season-long mystery about who did it, who caused it, what's going on with it, and that kind of reminds me a little bit too much of both the Burn and the Red Angel that we had in seasons 2 and 3, where it was very much about who caused this big mysterious thing going on here, and it just kind of feels a little bit not only repetitious, but a little bit like, okay, well, your answer to that question better be good, because otherwise it makes the entire rest of the season fall flat on a rewatch, because I go back and watch the Burn storyline, I go back and watch the Red Angel storyline, why I like individual stuff in those seasons, those arcs of that season fall flat because I did not enjoy how those shows ended that storyline. And so it just like, it's a big risk, and I'm like, I really wish that they had done something different here. Like, I would have much preferred this be just a natural phenomenon that we were just sciencing at and trying to figure out what to do with science. And I know that there's this blockbusterization sort of thing with Star Trek Discovery that is frustrating, that they need to have this sort of like big mystery going on here, but I was a little bit disappointed to see that. Now, they do turn it around for me a little bit towards the end of this episode, and we'll talk about that in a second, but right up front, I was just like, all right, I guess this is where we're going to be going with this. But then we get a scene back at Starfleet HQ meeting with Admiral Vance, and everyone's sort of talking to him about what the possibilities are for who created this. And we get a few little call-out Easter eggs here, like the Nassine, which were the caretakers from Star Trek Voyager. We get the Iconian Empire, which I guess are still around, which might be an oblong reference to Star Trek Online, where the Iconians were still around in that game, which was kind of cool. The Q Continuum gets a call-out here, and Vance said that we have not heard from them in over 600 years, which would be right around the time, I believe, a little after Star Trek Picard, or right around Star Trek Picard, and since we know Q is showing up in that show, maybe that's a little hint as to what might be happening in that's the last time that we've seen Q show up since season 2 of Star Trek Picard. But who knows? We'll see if that actually works out. Maybe the math might be a little bit wonky in my head. Also, we get a quick little reference to Aurelio, who is the scientist for the Emerald Chain that we saw at the end of season 3. It was nice to know that he is still around, especially since the actor who played him is a recurring actor on Star Trek Discovery and unfortunately is suffering from ALS. And from last I heard, probably will not be able to reappear to perform the character again on screen. So it was just nice to know that the character, at the very least in the universe, is still around and doing things, even if the actor, sadly, unfortunately, due to real-world issues, won't be able to appear back on screen. And Kenneth Mitchell is a wonderful human being, so I wish him all the best, and I hope everything is going well for him as best as possible. But that being said, we also get Burnham going to rescue a colony, and we also get the scientist Tarka, who is working with Aurelio and making the new spore drive, coming onto the Discovery to help discover more about the anomaly. And here's where the episode basically splits off into its 3 different A, B, and C storylines. So focusing on the first one, we have Burnham's storyline where she is going to rescue prisoners from the colony as it's about to be destroyed by the anomaly. The first scene we get here is a great scene between Book and Burnham, setting up how Book feels a need to rescue everyone. He does have that kind of savior complex, which will be reflected in Culber's storyline down in the C plot here. But we get a sense that Book feels the need, like, because my family died, I need to save as many people as possible, which I'm sure is setting up his complex for later on in the episode. And I liked Burnham sort of acknowledging that, but saying, like, hey, we can go rescue people, and maybe it'll be good for him. Then we get Burnham coming on the bridge where we meet the magistrate of this colony, who basically says, we're rescuing everybody, but there's these prisoners called examples that we're just going to let die. Now, obviously, this is reflective of how we treated prisoners during the early stages of the COVID-19 pandemic, where we sort of didn't think about them, we sort of let them flounder, and COVID-19 spread in prisons because they were seen as criminals, as less than. And this is something that happens repeatedly, not just during COVID-19, but prisoners are just not cared about, without us recognizing, as later scenes in this episode point out, that many people that are in prisons for being criminals are there for numerous different reasons that were just whether people were got with, like, possessing drugs or different things. It's a whole different discussion to have on our criminalization of things that should be not be criminalized, but this episode is definitely tangentially targeting that and saying that we should not care for these people just because they're quote-unquote criminals, regardless of the size or amount of their offense, is absolutely atrocious. And I really appreciated the show addressing this issue head-on with its COVID-19 metaphor with the anomaly. And I just want to be really, really clear here, considering that the episode does touch upon this, that there are many people that are in prisons for quote-unquote criminalized behaviors that are really just there to target specific communities and specific people and to really control certain communities and populations. I think, for example, like the war on drugs and how that disproportionately affected Black communities and communities of color, and how often people of color are ones that face higher rates of imprisonment due to having things like possessions of drugs, while white people will get away with it on a lesser sentence or charge. And therefore we criminalize entire communities and put them in prisons and then dehumanize them and not care about them when things like the pandemic occurs, let alone all the other issues that come with the criminalizations of different communities. And while not all directly addressed within this episode, I think that Star Trek Discovery is hinting at a lot of that stuff here, which I found to be truly excellent and a really wonderful part of the episode. We also get to see Reese taking over the evacuation efforts, which is good to see him here. This does lead me to one big criticism of the entire episode, though, in that throughout the entire book Burnham storyline, and kind of tangentially in other storylines as well, there's no sense of, like, real urgency. We keep getting told there's, like, only 3 hours to evacuate, only a few moments until we can evacuate this colony, and yet there's, like, scenes where we get characters stopping to have long conversations, such as when Book and Burnham stop to have a conversation with Reese, and Reese gets a nice moment saying, like, hey, this means important to me, my family got saved, so it's nice for me to be able to save other people and help refugees in this crisis. And I was like, that's very sweet. Why are you talking about that now? There are people that need saving. Go deal with that. So one knock I will say against the episode is that there's no sense of urgency that the situation kind of implied, like we had seen back in the premiere episode. The premiere episode of this season definitely had that sense of urgency with the crew trying to rescue everyone as quickly as possible, and that was kind of absent here during this evacuation effort. But Book and Burnham step into the prison complex, and I love their chemistry. They just have wonderful chemistry, these two, every single time. It's just always wonderful to see. But then they encounter this little bug thing, which was very, very cute and adorable until Book realizes that he can't communicate with it, that meaning it's a machine. And I thought that was a cool reveal, and getting to see, like, these bug-like machines trying to kill them and, like, burrow through rock. Cool little action sequence. I thought it was a lot of fun. But eventually, of course, they get through into the prison, where we meet our several different prisoners, and we learn, as I mentioned before, that these prisoners were there for pretty much not criminal offenses. They had just tried to steal for their family or things like that. Again, kind of relating to this idea that many people who commit crimes in our society today, especially in the United States, are just trying to do it to survive, or have been placed in societies where they don't have any other recourse but to commit what society says is crimes in order to survive. It's a longer conversation about prisons, but one that I think that this episode is definitely hinting at and leaning towards, and I'm glad that the show is saying that didactic political message. It's not as, like, beat you over the head with it as something like Deep Space Nine's Past Tense was in its homelessness problem episode, but it's definitely still here, and I really thought that was awesome, and I'm really appreciating that Discovery is finally doing these more didactically, obviously political storylines here, because that's what Star Trek, I think, needs and should do. I also liked the discussion here with the prisoners not really trusting Burnham and saying, the Federation never cared about us before, why should we trust you now? And Burnham really have to put her money where her mouth is and say, like, hey, we will grant you asylum, and that's going to cause us probably political problems down the line with this colony, especially since we're trying to rebuild the Federation and stuff like that, and we're trying to, like, help them at the moment, but I will offer you asylum as long as you ask for it. And I thought that was a really cool sequence with, like, just building trust with these prisoners, again, reflecting some obvious, like, why should we trust you things in real life? I will say, too, I also really liked the actor who was playing this sort of lead prisoner who was sort of talking Burnham through all of these things. Number one, it was nice to see an Indigenous cast member on Star Trek Discovery. It is sad that he does get killed, though, in the end, so I would like to see more Indigenous cast members that aren't murdered by the end of the episode, but it was nice to see him here. And I'm sure people from that community will have a lot more to say on that than I will, especially considering Star Trek's very, very let's just say mixed relationship with depicting Indigenous characters throughout its history, going all the way back to Star Trek, the original series. But that being said, I did like his storyline of saying, like, hey, I'm here to, my penance is trying to make sure that these people are okay, and I wish to stay behind, and can you give this, like, little history hologram back to the person who I stole it from, and him paying penance here. I thought that was kind of nice, and I liked that Burnham respected his agency in wishing to stay behind. It's not something I think I could have done, and I'm kind of on Book side a little bit on it, but I totally understand Burnham's reasoning here. It's a very hard choice to force someone to come with you if they want to basically go down with the ship thing here. And I understand Book feeling hurt by that, and I don't think he holds a grudge against Burnham, at least I hope not. We'll see if that continues on into future episodes, but at least appreciated here that Book felt really defeated by this because he has this need to save everyone after his family had died, and he just wants to save everyone. Even one life lost is a loss, like, it just really hits hard in his soul. And I'm like, again, that discussion of mental health and how, like, these things can be healing, but you need to be able to understand you cannot save everyone, kind of reflecting that Kobayashi Maru idea that was brought up in the first episode. So I like those themes of mental health and saving everyone idea being weaved throughout this entire season. But in the final scenes of this, I really love Burnham calling out the magistrate and saying, like, I hope you find a society that is better than the one that you helped build. Really just calling him out right in front of him, I thought was wonderful. And then the final sequence where she gives the hologram to the woman, I think was also very nice and just a good way to sort of continue to see, like, how life and society moves on. Also, we get a reference to Zora getting intelligence. Yes, the Discovery ship is finally getting more and more emotions, and I'm liking that that is coming back up. I was a little bit frustrated the fact that Zora gaining intelligence kind of had fallen on the back burner for most of the beginning of this season. So it's nice to be referenced here that she's like, you have emotions now? And Zora's like, yeah. And Burnham's like, cool. We'll deal with that eventually, which is kind of nice. So I thought that that was a cool little bring up here. But this, of course, brings us over to the other storyline with Stamets and Tarka. This was another storyline that I'm like, why is this happening during the middle of an evacuation storyline? Like, there's even references throughout this storyline of being like, well, we can't take power from the transporters because they're being used. I'm like, the evacuation is taking 3 hours. Can this science experiment wait maybe 3 hours and then you can deal with it instead of putting the entire ship and crew at risk during an evacuation, so thousands of people are at risk? So there was that, like, weird sense of, like, urgency that was missing from this storyline, or perhaps the opposite. There was urgency in this storyline that was missing from the other one that I think could have flip-flopped a little bit around. But regardless, I get it's like making storylines a little bit more concise in order to have things going on at the same time, but it just felt a little bit weird that all this was going on at the same moment. I'm like, Saru should be dealing with the evacuation, not like hanging out in the science bay dealing with some science test sort of stuff. That being said, I really enjoyed this storyline. The first scene that we get between Culber and Stamets, with Culber helping Stamets dress, and it was just nice to see their husband dynamic between the two of these characters, because it's something that's been a little bit missing throughout this season. We haven't gotten a ton of scenes between the two of them, so it's just a nice reminder that, like, they have a domestic life together. They help each other put on clothing and things, and it was very, very sweet to see. And I like both of them kind of bouncing off of each other and giving each other advice, with Culber's telling Stamets, like, let Tarka roll off your back because he hasn't really been responding to you, even though you've been wanting to work with him. So it was nice to see that. And then Stamets turning around trying to give Culber advice, but Culber being like, I'm a workaholic, I gotta go help with people and get to these appointments and be a counselor, sort of building off of a few episodes ago where he almost revealed to Book that he was having a hard time dealing with his own stuff as well during all of this. We'll talk about that in just a second. But getting to meet Tarka, who, by the way, is played by the same actor who played Ehrenreich over in The Expanse, so it was nice to see him show up here. I liked his villainous take on that character over in that scene. But it was really cool to see his character because, as Stamets himself later points out towards the end of the episode, Tarka very much reminds us of Stamets from Season 1. Kind of like a jerk, not completely like villainous or evil or antagonistic or anything like that. Just sort of an arrogant scientist that Stamets was very much like back in Season 1. So it was very much nice to sort of see how far Stamets has come in relation to contrasting him against Tarka here. So all of that stuff was great. And I'm not going to go through all this beat by beat because it's all like sciencey, wine-y stuff. Like there's the mashed potatoes beat with Tarka was really interesting. But ultimately this all leads us to basically discover that, yes, the anomaly is created by someone. It's created by a synthetic wormhole that Stamets had sort of hinted at earlier on, but it was definitely much more artificially created here. And they basically go through a whole bunch of experiments. There's fun stuff with Tig Notaro and Saru sort of bouncing off of them as they're trying to search for this answer here. And that's basically all we eventually learn here. Some fun beats within that though, with like Saru being kind of tense and being like, we need to deal with this, and the moment where Tarka's just getting him to scream was very fun, and like Saru like yelling at him, and I was like, oh dang, apparently Kelpians have a deep-throated voice that they can pull out at any moment, which is kind of cool. And also Tig Notaro's just humor is always wonderful and appreciated, with her saying like, yeah, Tilly left us 3 days ago and already we're gonna blow ourselves up with a wormhole, was hysterical. Just like her just bouncing off of everyone was just a ton of fun. And also Stamets sort of reflecting in Tarka the dogmatic pursuit of science in an almost reckless way was nice to see. And I almost wish that Stamets had learned a little bit more from that interaction, being like, maybe I don't need to put people at risk like Tarka does, like I used to, in search of science. And so I think that it could have been made a little bit more explicit. I get what they were getting at with that character, again, showing us how far he has come as a character from Season 1. But I think you could have hit the nail on the head just a little bit more, just to really draw out the theme that I think the writers were going for here with Stamets' character. But it is definitely there, and again, that contrast between the two men, which I like to see. Also, really quickly, it's worth mentioning that I really like that Tarka was a Rycian, having the little like Rycian symbol on his head, and obviously calling out to Risa, the pleasure planet. It's nice to see that, Risa gets sort of like pigeonholed as the pleasure planet. And again, I like Star Trek Discovery and modern Star Trek in general sort of breaking out that monoculture idea that there would be scientists who grew up on Risa, that it's not just all fucking and Horgons and Jaha Marone all the time on Risa. So that was it was a nice little breaking apart of that stereotypical idea, and nice to see a reference to Risa here. But that brings us over to the final plot of the episode, and one that was usually the shortest, but one that I think hit me absolutely the hardest, because we learned that Culber has been kind of working himself too hard, taking on more and more work, trying to help as many people as he possibly can. And he calls Kovich, who comes in here to give him like a blunt assessment. You got 10 minutes. I'm going to give you a very blunt assessment of your mental health needs, which is honestly something that is very helpful. Like for me, as someone who also does therapy, I appreciate my therapist being like, I'm just going to tell you how it is. And just like, I need people to just be very blunt with me and just tell me exactly what's going on and what they think in sometimes not smoothed over ways. It's just something that I need in my therapy. It's not for everybody, but it's something that helps with me. So I sort of saw myself a little bit in that in Culber. Even more so, we basically get Kovich calling out Culber saying, you died. You died, and because you died and came back, you felt you needed to have a purpose. Because if you came back and didn't have a purpose, it was a middle finger to anyone who has lost someone. Your life was a middle finger to anyone who's lost someone. So you needed your life to mean something, and so you developed a bit of a savior complex in order to try and pursue that. And that's why you become a workaholic, and you need to find life outside of work. I cannot tell you all how much that hit me personally. I mean, first and foremost, there is a queer reading of that with, if anyone looks back at the queer history of people during the 80s and the HIV epidemic, there was a lot of sense of loss and trauma within the queer community that I was not a part of, to be fair. I'll talk about my own personal stuff in just a second, but the queer community lost a lot of people, and the people that survived felt like, my life is I feel like I should not have survived when so many other people died in the LGBTQ family and the LGBTQ world. And this is not something that's exclusive to the LGBTQ people, but Wilson Cruz being gay, and that being very much a part of his character, I think was very much being reflected in that idea, in how that sort of reflected the queer community very much so. But again, I think it's not exclusive to the queer community. But on a personal level, I cried at this because this particularly hit me kind of very hard, because as many of you know, I'm a bit of a workaholic. And something I have come to realize the reason for my workaholism was when I was growing up, because I'm trans, I did not care about my life. I hated my life. And I didn't care about myself. And so I wanted to give my life to others, to try and help others, because I did not feel like I was worth saving or being alive. And ever since I came out as trans, my life has felt renewed and my own. But I also felt like this can't be just for me. I need to give back to as many people as possible, because I need to have a purpose for being able to feel this way, for feeling good, for feeling alive, for feeling myself. In many ways, I had died and come back to life, and I feel I need to constantly give that back to people. And it's part of why I'm a workaholic, because I just feel the need to constantly give back to people. I'm sorry that I'm getting personal here, but that whole scene just gut punched me, because it felt so true to me. And I needed to hear it. And I've heard it before. This episode wasn't revelatory to me in that way, but it was definitely something that just reflected my life. And I have to say, this season's continued focus on mental health and the importance of mental health, in not just the face of big things like the pandemic, but also in small scale ways and ways that we always need to kind of think about our mental health, has been very, very meaningful. And I'm sure also this idea of being workaholics during the pandemic, considering there's things like the Great Resignation going on here, is very much reflective for a lot of other people in a lot of different ways as well. So I really think, as short as this sequence was with Culber, I think that it was, for me, easily the most impactful. And I really loved to see it here. And David Cronenberg being his bluntest and best, I think was wonderful. And I think this was my favorite scene of the episode. So I just wanted to share all that with you. So apologies for being a little bit indulgent on it, but there you go. But Taking a breath, getting into the last little bit of the episode here, we have Book hanging out in the sexy Star Trek Discovery bar, and he meets up with Tarka, who recognizes him as the other Spore Drive controller. But Book realizes, like, you know who is running the anomaly. You know what's going on in there, and he kind of needles him for information. And Tarka doesn't let too much slip, but he basically says this needs a huge power source, like a giant star, to run this thing. And it's definitely not the Iconians. It's definitely not, any of these people that we know of. So who else could it be? And Book has a sense that he knows something, and there's that symbol on the back of his neck, the scar on the back of his neck. So I'm sure that they'll be built out a little bit more. And I will say, this has me interested. I am hopeful this gets paid off well because, again, I did not want the season-long storyline to be like a, ooh, who's behind it sort of thing. But I am mildly intrigued because it does sort of hint at like these eldritch horror kind of things going on in the Star Trek universe. Because I do like this sort of like, oh, there's these gods that have all these powers, which is something that's always hinted about in Star Trek. If you look back even to the original series, like the Preservers and stuff like that, even going into Star Trek Picard with those like eldritch horror squid metal aliens that we saw at the end of Star Trek Picard season 1, there's definitely a lot of eldritch horror elements of Star Trek of the Star Trek universe in general. So I like that being brought in here, and it does seem hopefully that the writers have a little bit more precise answers in mind, unlike clearly with the Red Angel and the Burn, where it was sort of like figured out on the fly. Hopefully they have a bit more of a clear trajectory in mind for this season. It's not just going to be willy-nilly stuff being brought up just to bring it up. We'll see. I'm willing to go along with this, but I will say I am cautiously negative. I usually will say I'm cautiously optimistic. I'm cautiously negative, but I'm willing to be turned around on it. But I'm just a little bit cautiously negative on it, but I was intrigued by this scene. So overall, I think big picture stuff with Star Trek Discovery season, I'm a little bit cautious on, but this episode specifically and how it dealt with its themes and ideas, both on a personal level, a mental health level, a political level, a character level, was truly some of the strongest stuff that Star Trek Discovery has done. It doesn't measure up to the last episode, I think is my personal favorite this season so far, but this was definitely another strong entry in this season, and I really love to see it. So that's my thoughts on this episode of Star Trek Discovery, The Examples. I'd love to hear your thoughts down in the comments below. Did you enjoy this episode as much as I did? I'd love to hear all of that. But beyond all of that, don't forget to subscribe. Patreon tomorrow, if you are watching this on the Thursday that this video comes out, tomorrow is going to be my Sex in Star Trek video. I'm very excited. It's 2 hours, over 2 hours long. It is one of the best videos that I've ever made. The premiere is going to be going up at 10 a.m. Pacific time on my channel, so join me in the live chat. Otherwise, check it out afterwards. But I am very pleased with this video. It's something that means a lot to me, so I'd love for you to come and join me for that. But beyond all of that, I hope that you, as always, live long and prosper.